tribute to one of the few people that I know in the world who truly became a legend in his own time. I refer, of course, to our brilliant and wonderful colleague, George Shepard. But when describing him, I think the word magic is a good description. Webster's dictionary describes magic as, quote, requiring more than human power, startling in performance, producing effects that seem supernatural. George Shepard's teaching and his performance transcended most mortal boundaries and ascended into higher realms, leaving us transfixed in beauty, knowledge, and with higher standards than we thought possible. He was, in a word, magic. The number has outlined in your program his brilliant career, and so I will not reiterate those accomplishments, but I want to point out that he also made more than 50 recordings that include solo piano music, as well as concertos with orchestra, and many chamber music discs. When Mr. Sebok was named Distinguished Professor, it was necessary to have letters of support, which the university always requires. I would like to just quote this afternoon from one of those letters, because it describes, I think, so well what George did his whole life. This comes from the director of the Toho School, and I quote him, George Sebok's gifts to students and professors of the Toho School are enormous as he opens the windows of their hearts to music. He presents the grandeur of Gothic in Handel, clarity and spirit in Mozart, passion and warmth in Beethoven, characteristic variety with rich sonority in Schumann, fantastic storytelling in Liszt, and the depth of love for his mother language in Bartok. I think that's a very beautiful and wonderful description of George Sebok's musical life. His musicianship was characterized over and over with the words extraordinary taste, sensitivity, formidable technique, richness of color, clarity of articulation, and intimate knowledge of style. It is impossible in this brief time to give even a hint of the reviews of his work that have appeared in newspapers and periodicals around the world. Some quotes are so fascinating, however, that I would like to share just one of those with you. In reviewing a Paris concert of music of Debussy in Chronique Musicale, the critic Jean Roy had this to say, and I quote from the review. Because George Sebok, in his last concert, interpreted Debussy's Suite Bergamasque with such exquisite nuances, such intangible sonorities, some have said a new Gieseking has appeared. To deny this is in no way to diminish him, for just as Gieseking has always been Gieseking, without reference to other illustrious predecessors, so Sebok is simply Sebok, and his personality, complex and pleasing, seems particularly difficult to define. This afternoon, we gather to praise one of the most extraordinary musicians ever appointed to the faculty of Indiana University Jacob School of Music. But I want to take a moment his wonderful wife, Vitsa, who is with us this afternoon, and who provided inspiration and support for all that he did. No married person can succeed as magnificently as he did without the sensitive understanding and generous support of a spouse. Vitsa and George were the ideal couple, reveling in a deep and mutual love and providing a superb example for all to emulate. More than 400 years ago, Ben Jonson wrote a 10-line poem describing his poetic hero, John Donne. I want to share that with you as I close, because I think it has words very appropriate in describing our wonderful colleague. This is the 10-line poem. Donne, the delight of Phoebus and each muse, who to thy one all other brains refuse, whose every work of thy most early wit came forth example and remains so yet, longer a-knowing than most wits do live, and with no affection praise enough can give. To it thy language, letters, arts, best life, which might with half mankind maintain a strife, all which I meant to praise, and yet I would but leave, because I cannot as I should. Alas, today, we cannot describe George Sebok, the man, the musician, the teacher, as we should. And like Jonson, though almost 400 years later, no affection, praise enough can give. George's language, letters, arts, and best life will live far into the future, as those who knew and loved him continue to be inspired and in turn inspire countless generations to come. He was indeed magic. Thank you very much.
When asked what he would have been if not a pianist, the answer I heard Professor Sebok give was probably a neurosurgeon. At first, one might note the stark contrast of the two professions, but the more I thought about it, the more I saw the similarities of what he did and what a neurosurgeon does. A great neurosurgeon knows anatomy and the science of the body, including, of course, that of the brain. Professor Sebok knew the science of playing and music. He had a special ability to tap into the mind connection so his students could better comprehend and experience the physiology of motion, sound, and silence. He never used the word retraining, yet was able to unlock and change my technique, helping to rid me of considerable tension. He, in essence, rewired my brain by magical gestures, examples of different movements, a breath, a look, a word, an analogy, a touch, or a more elaborate explanation. My favorite moments during lessons were when he conducted while I played, injecting a musical message that seemed to then happen spontaneously. The others were when he played. During those moments, he held me spellbound. During 2 years of World War II, he was forced to pound large rocks into gravel for roads in the Carpathian Mountains. After peeling off layers of skin from his hands after the war, he analyzed the physiology of playing to regain the technique he previously had. This made him a unique teacher who understood deeper the science because he had to start over. A great neurosurgeon not only knows the science of medicine, he knows the art. He loved to study and explore music's mysteries and messages and their connection to life and the universe. He respected the composers as the real geniuses and considered himself humbly their interpreter, a curator of rare artistic gems, always searching for the truth in the music and what it could say. Mrs. Sebok once mentioned to me that her husband enjoyed practicing the most when he discovered something new in the music and how best to communicate it. That process never stopped. If given the opportunity, the greatest of neurosurgeons would no doubt want and be able to pass on knowledge and secrets to his or her students. Professor Sebok shared his knowledge, stories, anecdotes, ideas with true sincerity, and yes, with subtle wit and humor. That made the experience oftentimes profound, and other times entertaining. A former student, Mary Elizabeth Bradley, recounted how she felt so nervous at her first lesson that she told him she could not play the first note. He said, "Well, play the second." She did, and went fine from there. Barbara Lister Singh, currently a piano professor at Salem College in North Carolina, heard Professor Sebok play only once while in Amsterdam in the 1970s, and a decade later she met him. She said, although the encounters were brief, they left acute and lasting impressions. I quote her, "To me, Mr. Sebok symbolized the rarest and most treasured kind of playing. It was playing in which nothing got in the way of the music, and the music, the piano, and the musician were one." Just like a great neurosurgeon would adapt to changing variables with skill, so did Professor Sebok demonstrate a unique ability to draw out the best in his students. He claimed not to have a method, but I think his method was to listen and search into the depths of the music and into each individual performance. A great neurosurgeon would be able to communicate effectively, both an outcome and possible problems. Professor Sebok knew how to get to the point, and he didn't play games. Early in my studies, after my first playing of Mozart, he didn't tell me I had no clue what the style of Mozart should be. Instead, he asked me how many symphonies and chamber music pieces of Mozart I had heard. No more needed to be said. He once told me that teaching is like standing in front of a vending machine that has many unmarked buttons. One pushes a button and hopes the right product comes out. I think, judging by the contingent of students whose lives and music have been positively affected by the great teacher, he pushed a lot of right buttons. In my opinion, he should be awarded posthumously a doctorate in pianistic neurosurgery. Thank you, Professor Sebok and Mrs. Sebok, for being part of our universe.
Thanks, Liz. I first heard of George Sebok when I attended the recital that he and Mr. Starker played at Lawrence University during my freshman year at that university. I remember that the concert was extremely exciting and everyone was talking about it for days afterward. A few years later, my piano teacher at the time spent the summer in Mr. Shepard's studio here in Wilmington. And in the fall, he came back to school with such enthusiasm for piano playing and teaching because of this new teacher he had encountered. When it was time for me to consider graduate school, there were 3 teachers at 3 different schools who were possibilities. Mr. Sebok in Bloomington, John Sims in Iowa, and Stanley Fletcher in Illinois. But after a trip to Bloomington and seeing the new round building, there was no question about the school. It was just a matter of how to get accepted into Mr. Sebok's class. My teacher wrote to him about the possibility of my studying with him in Bloomington, and then I followed up with a letter of my own, to which Mr. Sebok responded, I still have his letter, suggesting that we meet in Chicago for an audition. Well, what a time this would turn out to be. He was to play the Beethoven Triple Concerto with the Chicago Symphony, and I was to play for him on the stage of Orchestra Hall in Chicago after the orchestra had rehearsed. Imagine the exhilaration I felt looking forward to this experience. After performing Bach and Beethoven, I played the last movement of the Prokofiev 7th Sonata, and when I finished, he asked me if I breathed when I played. And my answer was, I don't know. And his response was, you should. Followed by what I have fondly called the Sebok chuckle. Early days in Bloomington were different than I expected. It was a huge campus. I was one of many good pianists instead of being the big fish in the small pond. In short, I felt really inferior. I recall that when I had a really good piano lesson, I would go down to Sully's Open Bucket and spend $10, which was 20% of my assistantship check, on a dinner to celebrate. But I soon learned that what I was looking for was the wrong thing. Mr. Sebok was not going to teach me secrets of the piano or his method, because he always said there wasn't one, or the way to total relaxation of the piano. He later said, if you're totally relaxed, you will fall off the bench. It took me a while to understand the breadth and depth of his teaching. He used analogies, related piano playing to science or literature or language. He talked about things that I had never thought of before. And when I opened my grades after the end of the first semester and saw an A next to piano, I almost passed out. Now, I could speak with you about the many wonderful lessons where I learned so much that has stayed with me through the years. But when I think of Mr. Sebok and the many facets of his personality, I recall his love of humor and laughter. He told so many entertaining stories, and there were so many events that I recall that even after 40 years and more, I still laugh out loud when I recall some of them. I remember his talking about a performance he did in Indianapolis shortly after he arrived in Bloomington. It was for some sort of musical club, perhaps an introduction to the musical elite of India. In any case, the introduction went something like this. You may not have heard much about Mr. Sebok, but when you hear him play, you won't care. And he laughed and laughed and laughed at this because of the double meaning. In fall of 1966, my first semester on campus, I played a Mozart sonata in the Saturday afternoon piano class. When I finished, one of the first things he spoke about was the potential weight of the arm and how to raise the left arm from the shoulder in preparation for his entry in measure 4. Now, to demonstrate some of this, he asked for a female student's purse that had a strap, and he was whirling the purse over his head rather like a lasso, when someone opened the door and looked in. The person stood there for a few seconds, shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, and closed the door. And Mr. Sebok chuckled for some time, as we all do. His stories about page turners were wonderful. I remember the incident when someone from the audience agreed to turn pages but confessed that they didn't read music very well. Mr. Sebok assured the person not to worry. Just watch my head, and when I nod, turn the page. Well, it was a chamber music piece, and when the ensemble was to start, Mr. Sebok looked around, raised his head with the company cue, and the page turned. He laughed when telling about the Holiday Inn in New Orleans where he stayed. I believe it was the Holiday Inn, where the toilet had a white band across the seat that said sanitized, but it wasn't flushed. In one of my early lessons, I finished playing something and he commented, Your wrist doesn't move. To which I naively replied, I know. He burst out laughing and he said, but your wrist should move. And then we both started laughing. After having been out of school for more than a week with a severe sore throat and having missed 2 successive lessons because of illness, I had prepared the Ballet d'Obernon and was prepared to play it from beginning to end from memory. I recall the room becoming darker and darker as the sun set in the afternoon. Light seemed not to be a possibility, and he stood in the corner next to the door smoking a cigarette as I began to play. You have to know now that this was the only piece that I had prepared for the lesson. I expected quite a lengthy discussion of what to do, how to play this and that, so on and so forth. So I played my little heart out, no stops, no memory slips, maybe a few wrong notes. And nearly 15 minutes later, I came to the end on that E major chord. I lifted the pedal and my hand, and I waited. And after a few seconds, which seemed like an eternity, he said, that was wonderful. What is next? I was dumbstruck and confessed with a stammering voice that I thought perhaps he could have some comments on the piece. And he said, well, you play it musically, you play it convincingly, what more is there to say? But we did have some further discussion. Of course, there were the things that we discussed, the serious things, like the war in Vietnam and the possibility of my being drafted. When he told me of his own experiences in the Second World War, I was embarrassed to have expressed my self-concern. Or in May of 1970, when a student strike might have interfered with one of my recitals, he said, if someone interrupts your concert, tell them you will stop playing. If, by not playing the Mozart concerto, the war will stop. Or when a tragedy on campus made my studying for prelims almost impossible, his words of wisdom and comfort kept me sane and focused, with a philosophy that life is too precious to waste over something so relatively trivial as an exam. I remember the parties that he and Mrs. Sebok had for the class, where we were treated to veal purple, chicken paprikash, and we still use the recipes that you gave us, Liptauer cheese, and after-dinner armagnac, and the occasional dinner that Lois and I hosted for them in our little apartment in Everman, eating on a card table covered by a tablecloth, sharing French wine and good times. It's like yesterday, and yet it's like centuries in the past. I had many visits with Mr. Sebok after I finished my studies with him. I remember his pride and yearning. And when Lois and I were in Austria and viewed the television broadcast of him in Berlin, which I believe we're going to see shortly, we shared our feelings of gratitude to have known both Lisa and Mr. Sebok for so many years. In 1997, the 75th birthday celebration in this very hall was such a joyous occasion. Just 2 short years later, he left us, creating a void in the academic and musical world over which we continue to breathe. There will never be another Mr. Sebok, but truly, there will always be Mr. Sebok that lives on in the memories and careers of his students and friends, whether they are teachers, performers, scholars, or whatever. The influence that he has had on thousands of students, directly or indirectly, and the beauty that he brought to tens of thousands of people throughout the world through his performances will live on in the hearts, the souls, and the minds of us all. When Lois and I sat in this hall to remember him nearly 10 years ago, we knew that a part of life itself had left our very beings. A few weeks later, when we watched Mr. Starker enter the backstage entrance of a concert hall in Paris to perform a memorial concert for Mr. Sebok, we knew that a certain finality and closure had come to some of the greatest chapters in our lives. There is hardly a day that goes by that I do not think of this great man, what he lived for, what he taught me. If I had to do it all over again, I would change only 2 things. I would have worked more diligently, and I would have soaked up even more of the musical and life-changing wisdom he offered. It is truly an honor for me to speak on this occasion. I come here with a joyful heart, filled with gratitude to this great university, and for the opportunity it gave me to experience George Sebok as an outstanding teacher, a marvelous pianist, a significant mentor for me, and my very dear friend. And for this, I am most thankful.
think it's a mistake, however.
My experiences with Mr. Shevik began in 1965, 44 years ago. Mrs. Shevik, I fear you have made a mistake. Now, I've just talked with you, and you say it's somebody else's mistake. Or have forgotten that I'm a cellist with my friends. I barely made it through one semester with Mr. Shevik, as his only piano minor ever. It's all my dear mother's fault. No, it's Dr. Reynolds' fault. My parents and I back home in Utica, New York, had agreed I would major in music and major in language at IU. My advisor, Dr. Reynolds, with his kind, sweet voice, told me I would lose my music scholarship if I had two majors. I called home that night. Mother said firmly, "Okay then, you find the best piano teacher in the school and go tomorrow and knock on his door." Next day, I find Mr. Shevik's door and boldly knock. Mr. Shevik assigns me to David Montgomery. Do you remember him? He was from Utica, New York, a teaching assistant. Next semester, I knock on Mr. Shevik's door. It's David Montgomery again. The next semester, David Montgomery is gone. I knock on Mr. Shevik's door. "May I study with you?" With a quizzical smile, he says, "Yes." I called my mother that night. He gave me a Mozart A major concerto and the Ravel Sonatina. One lesson I remember so well. I felt Bela Bartok kindly looking down from the wall in front of us. Mr. Shevik and I were talking about Ravel and Fauré. He said the French people adore Fauré. They don't like Ravel. One Saturday he asked me to play in class. I called my mother that night. I played the first movement of the Mozart concerto from Carolyn Pope. Mr. Shevik asks the class what was unusual about my playing. There was no answer. Her left hand always sounds like a cello playing. Work on the Ravel Sonatina came to a point where I knew it should be memorized by now. I hadn't had the time and was exhausted at the end of the semester, with like 22-hour credits. Through tears, I muttered that preparing 2 lessons a week for him and Mr. Starker was way too much for me. Where I am now. His warm smile glowed with understanding. I thank you, Mrs. Shevik, and all those who have made this memorial for Mr. Shevik happen. It keeps my memory alive. I am with him and Mr. Starker every day. At the cello, with my search, for the sound to come straight from my heart. The attention from the moment focuses fully on the sensation of the body moving. That magically unlocks the feeling to flow freely. When our trio, Sebok Remembering NOV, came a few years ago for a lesson, more than 15 years ago, with Mr. Starker and Mr. Shevik, I will never forget how Mr. Shevik played a passage in the Brahms C major trio. First vertically, like a pianist, and then horizontally, pulling his right arm across the keyboard like a bow across the string. The difference in the sound of the piano that was meant. Thank you very much.
Mr. Shevek always smoked in lessons. I never cared. I always thought I'd get a better lesson if he didn't get distracted wishing for a cigarette. Sometimes I wondered whether I could play so well he'd just forget to light one up. It never happened. It only hit me after he was gone that distracting him from smoking might mean I played badly, not well. This smoking habit came with ease and class, a refinement that matched the elegance of everything this great man did. These Winston cigarettes came from a cigarette case, each extracted with economy of means before it was inserted into one of two cigarette holders. Dunhill, I think, with filtration crystals that Mr. Shevek said improved the taste. I'd never seen a person use a holder for his cigarettes before. Already this was a transfixing sight, but watching Mr. Shevek smoke his way through a cigarette was like watching a little ballet. The holder moved freely from hand to hand, and to his mouth and back again. Somehow, during the lesson, he would manage demonstrating at the piano, never losing grasp of the cigarette, either in his mouth or in his hand. It never looked like juggling. It looked easy, free, calm, and refined. It seemed to me he played a little game with his ash. He would go through long, long stretches without ever tapping off his ash into the ashtray on his desk. At times he had as much as 2 inches of ash glowing at the end of his cigarette, just waiting to fall. Still, the cigarette in its holder moved from hand to mouth and back again, but never did the ash surprise its master. Mr. Shevek never even glanced towards the cigarette's smoldering end. He always knew exactly when it was time for this long, gray and white pile to reach its fate in the tray. Like almost everything my teacher ever said or did, this hypnotic ritual taught me a great deal. Even his smoking served as an example of the same economy of means and motion that he taught at the piano. That elegance, refinement, and physical grace were goals worthy of attention even in the most mundane of daily tasks. That the nature of effective movement at the piano or elsewhere required us to discard those things that are not necessary. He found a way of illustrating this, how to let go of what we do not need in every aspect of his life. I remember his giving me a lesson shortly after a surgery. They took out my gallbladder, he told me triumphantly. It's one of those organs we don't really need. Likewise, I remember his telling me about the time he took apart his washing machine. I don't remember if he said it was broken or whether he just wanted to see how it worked. But after he took it apart, he had, of course, to put it back together. When he was done, he said he had a handful of nuts and bolts remaining that had no clear home. Still, he said, the washing machine worked, and worked fine. He said to me, again, triumphantly, it seems those bolts really were necessary. With this man, I learned to play better even when he was not talking to me about music. Towards the end of our time together, he said to me, I worry sometimes that we have conversations instead of lessons. I tried to explain to him that it didn't matter, that even with conversations, I was learning more about music and piano playing than I ever could have hoped, that I treasured each and every one of our conversations. I don't know how well I explained. Something about Mr. Shevek always made me a little tongue-tied. Still, I think he knew he taught by example, that there were lessons to be learned from everything he said or did, even from something as simple as his act.
そんな荷物にならないから持ってポケットの中に入って。